Jameson Wilde sat in his office, staring out over the sprawling skyline of the city, lost in thought. At 37, he had everything a man could possibly want: money, power, influence. His tech empire was one of the largest in the world, and his name carried weight in every boardroom, every high-rise, every government office. Yet, despite all his success, there was one thing he lacked: a family. It wasn't something he'd ever really thought about until recently. His parents were both gone, and his closest relative, his Uncle Mark, had died unexpectedly 6 months ago. The news had rocked him, but the deeper shock came when he learned that his uncle had left behind a stipulation in his will, a clause that Jameson never saw coming. The Wilde family business was built on a foundation of generational wealth, but there was one problem: the family needed a direct heir. For the company to remain intact and continue to grow, there had to be someone to carry on the legacy. The company's board of directors had made it clear: Jameson needed to marry and produce an heir. The only thing standing between him and his future as the undisputed ruler of his empire was a wife. The catch? She wasn't someone he could choose. His uncle had arranged everything through a lawyer, who had already selected a woman for him. The details were straightforward. No love. No romance. Just a business arrangement, an heir to secure the future of Wilde Technologies. There was no room for sentimentality in this equation, just cold, hard practicality. At first, Jameson resisted the idea. He was used to getting what he wanted on his terms. He'd never had any use for emotional entanglements. His relationships were short and transactional, a series of flings with women who knew their place and were content with it. He never allowed himself to feel anything deeper. Love, he believed, was a weakness, a dangerous distraction. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had no choice. The company needed him, and he needed to play his part. So, after several sleepless nights filled with conflicting thoughts, Jameson signed the papers and committed to the arrangement. The lawyer was efficient and cold. He handed Jameson the file with a set of photographs and a brief biography of the woman he was to marry, Leila Benson. He skimmed through the document, noting the lack of any emotional connection, any kind of attachment that might bind them together. Leila was a stranger to him, an unknown quantity. The only thing that mattered was that she met the criteria. But when the meeting with her was set, Jameson had no idea what he was walking into. He'd pictured someone like all the others, someone easily manipulated, someone who would go along with the plan without question. But when he met her, he couldn't have been more wrong. Leila Benson arrived in his office one rainy afternoon, a tall, poised woman with strikingly sharp features. She had dark, shoulder-length hair, and her eyes, those piercing green eyes, were full of a quiet intensity that immediately unsettled Jameson. She didn't smile, didn't offer any small talk. There was something commanding about her, something that made Jameson stand at attention without even realizing it. "Mr. Wilde," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I trust this won't take long. I'm here to fulfill the terms of the agreement." Jameson nodded, surprised by the bluntness of her tone. He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk, and she sat down without hesitation, crossing her legs with an air of confidence that only added to her allure. There was something about her that he couldn't quite place, a mixture of beauty, intelligence, and strength. "Of course," he replied, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I'm sure you know why you're here. This is simply a formality." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm aware of the terms. There's no need for us to pretend otherwise, Mr. Wilde. We both know that this marriage is nothing more than a business transaction. I'm not interested in love, and I trust you feel the same." Jameson found himself taken aback by her directness. He had expected a woman who would try to charm him or play some sort of role, but instead, here was a woman who saw through the facade of their arrangement with chilling clarity. "I'm glad we understand each other," Jameson said, finally finding his voice. "This is a partnership, nothing more." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as if assessing him. "I don't need your wealth, Mr. Wilde. I have my own life, my own resources. What I need is stability, something this marriage can provide." For a moment, Jameson said nothing. He studied her, trying to decipher the emotions, or lack thereof, beneath her cool exterior. She was different from the women he was used to. She wasn't looking for anything from him except what the contract had promised. It was almost as if she didn't care who he was, who he had become. She was here for business, and nothing else. "Understood," he replied finally, leaning back in his chair. "We'll proceed as planned. No need to complicate things with emotions." "Agreed," Leila said, her lips curving slightly at the corners as though she found amusement in the simplicity of the arrangement. Jameson didn't know why, but something about her unnerved him. She was composed in a way that felt both foreign and intriguing. He had expected her to be more pliable, more submissive to his will. But there was nothing passive about her. He was used to being the one in control, but with her, that control seemed tenuous at best. And yet, he couldn't look away. There was something in her gaze, something that made him want to know more. As they finalized the details of the contract, Jameson found himself wrestling with an emotion he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. But curiosity, he reminded himself, was a dangerous thing. He had to remain detached. This was just business, after all. Leila Benson was nothing more than a pawn in the game he had to play. Still, as he watched her leave his office that afternoon, something lingered in the air, something he couldn't shake off. Jameson Wilde had always prided himself on keeping his emotions under control, but he couldn't help but wonder if, for the first time, he might have just made a dangerous mistake. As the door closed behind her, he felt an odd sense of anticipation, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The first few weeks of Jameson Wilde's marriage to Leila Benson passed in a blur of routine. There was no romance, no passion, just cold, calculated agreement between two people who were bound by a contract, not by love. It wasn't that he didn't expect this. After all, the arrangement had been made with the express purpose of securing a business legacy, not a personal connection. But even so, something about the whole situation began to gnaw at him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Jameson had always been a man of control. His world was meticulously organized, every aspect of his life shaped by his own hand. He had carefully avoided relationships that might tie him down, preferring the brief, transactional encounters that required little emotional investment. The idea of a wife, let alone one with whom he might form any deep connection, had seemed unnecessary, even burdensome. And yet, here he was, sharing his home with a woman who, despite their agreement, began to stir feelings in him that he had long ago shut away. Leila was not like the women he had known. There was an elegance about her, yes, but it was more than just physical beauty. It was the way she moved, the way she spoke, everything about her was calculated, yet effortless. She seemed to float through their shared existence with the same calm grace that characterized her every gesture. It wasn't that she was cold or distant, on the contrary, she was warm, in her own way. But there was something behind her eyes, something guarded and impenetrable, that made it impossible for Jameson to truly understand her. Most nights, after their brief exchanges during dinner, Leila would retreat to her room, often not to be seen until the next morning. Their conversations were polite, respectful, but nothing more. And yet, in the silence between them, Jameson found himself watching her more than he'd ever intended. It was a simple thing that first caught his attention. One evening, after a particularly long day in the office, he came home later than usual. He had expected to find the house quiet, as it had been every other night, but instead, he heard the soft sound of a piano playing in the background. It was a gentle, melancholy melody that seemed to fill the space with a sense of tranquility that Jameson hadn't known he was missing. Curious, he followed the sound down the hallway to the grand living room, where he found Leila seated at the piano, her fingers moving over the keys with a fluidity that seemed to come naturally to her. She wasn't playing anything grand or complex, but the simplicity of the piece felt like a glimpse into something deeper, a side of her that she kept hidden from the world. Jameson stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if he should interrupt. But there was something about the way she played that made him hesitant to break the spell. He watched her, transfixed, until she finished the piece, and when she finally turned to look at him, there was no surprise in her eyes, as though she had known he was there all along. "You're home late," she said, her voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of something he couldn't place. She stood up from the piano bench, her eyes locking with his for a brief moment before she broke the connection, as though unwilling to let him see too much. "I didn't expect to find you playing," Jameson replied, his voice betraying a hint of something he wasn't prepared to acknowledge, fascination, perhaps. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "I didn't know you could play." Leila smiled, though it wasn't the kind of smile that conveyed warmth. It was more like an acknowledgement of the moment, a fleeting glimpse of something untold. "Not many people do," she said, as she walked past him, heading toward the hallway. "It's something I do for myself." Her words hung in the air long after she had disappeared into her room. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Jameson found himself standing in the living room, staring at the piano, a strange feeling gnawing at him. He hadn't been expecting this. He hadn't been expecting her to have layers, to be more than just a name on a contract, more than just a convenient tool to fulfill his family's demands. The following days were no different, at least on the surface. Jameson and Leila went through the motions of married life, both maintaining the facade of indifference. They never crossed paths for long, their interactions were mostly limited to polite dinners and brief exchanges in the morning. And yet, something about her began to linger in his mind, pulling at him, slowly but surely. He found himself noticing little things about her that he hadn't before. The way she held herself with such quiet confidence, as if she was aware of something he wasn't. Her voice, which was calm but carried an authority that made others listen when she spoke. The way she could sit in a room and command attention without saying a word. She was a paradox, distant yet present, cold yet warm. Every time he thought he had her figured out, another layer revealed itself, making her more intriguing, more enigmatic. One evening, they sat across from each other at dinner, the silence between them stretching for what seemed like an eternity. Jameson was acutely aware of her presence, as though she had become an inescapable force in his life, and he found it unsettling. "You've been unusually quiet tonight," Leila remarked, her gaze lifting from her plate. "I thought you were always full of words." Jameson gave her a sharp look, though he was taken off guard by her directness. There was something unnerving about the way she seemed to see through him, as though she could read his every thought. "I'm just tired," he replied curtly, trying to brush off the feeling of vulnerability she had managed to provoke in him. "A lot of work." Leila didn't push further. Instead, she took a sip of her wine and continued to eat her meal in silence. But Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that this silence between them was different. It was as though she was waiting for something, as if she were biding her time, watching him, studying him. He found himself wondering why, but he wasn't about to ask. He didn't want to know the answer. It wasn't until a week later that Jameson finally realized just how deeply he had begun to care about what was happening between them, even though he had promised himself he wouldn't. One evening, when he returned home from a particularly stressful meeting, he walked into their shared living space to find Leila standing by the window, staring out at the city below. Her back was to him, but her posture, tense, almost guarded, struck him in a way he couldn't explain. "Leila," he said, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and concern. "Is something wrong?" She turned to face him slowly, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stood there, neither of them speaking. Finally, she shook her head, as if to dismiss whatever it was she had been thinking. "No," she said, her voice quiet. "Nothing's wrong." But the way she said it didn't convince him. There was a distance between them, an emotional barrier that he hadn't noticed before, and for the first time, Jameson realized how much he was beginning to care about breaking through it. The realization struck him hard. He had become entangled in this marriage, this arrangement that was supposed to be so simple, so impersonal. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Jameson didn't know what to make of it. He was no longer just fulfilling a family obligation. Somewhere along the way, he had started to feel something for Leila. Something dangerous. Something he had promised never to allow. As he stood there, staring at her, he knew that nothing about this arrangement was as simple as it had seemed at the start. And for the first time, he wasn't sure whether he was ready for the consequences of what that might mean. Jameson sat at his desk, staring at the contracts scattered before him, but his mind was elsewhere. The quiet hum of the office did little to block out the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. It had been nearly a month since his marriage to Leila, and although they still maintained their cordial but distant routine, something had changed. He couldn't quite place it, but he could feel it deep in his bones, something unspoken, something that lingered in the air between them. He had promised himself that he wouldn't get emotionally involved. He had told himself that this marriage was just a business transaction, a necessary step to secure his family's legacy and maintain control over wild technologies. But every day, he found himself more intrigued, more captivated by Leila. There was something about her that made it impossible to ignore her presence. She wasn't just a beautiful woman with a sharp mind, she was a mystery, a puzzle he couldn't solve. That evening, as he returned home later than usual, he was surprised to find the house quiet. The usual sounds of their routine, dinner, the soft rustle of papers, her footsteps echoing in the hall, were absent. It was as if the house itself had fallen into a deep, eerie silence. Jameson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something was off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this silence was more than just coincidence. He found her in the study, standing by the large windows that overlooked the city. The dim light from the setting sun cast a golden glow on her figure, making her appear ethereal, almost otherworldly. She wasn't playing the piano like she had that one night, but there was something in her posture, tense, guarded, that suggested she was lost in thought. He hesitated for a moment, not wanting to intrude, but something about the stillness in the room pulled him toward her. "Leila?" His voice was soft, tentative, as he stepped closer. She didn't immediately turn to face him, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant noise of the city below. Finally, she shifted, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "I didn't expect you to be home this late," she said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it that he hadn't heard before. "You've been busy lately." Jameson frowned, taking in her words. There was something in her tone, a subtle accusation, though he couldn't quite place what it was. He had been busy, that much was true. The company was growing rapidly, and there were countless meetings, deals, and decisions that required his full attention. But he knew that wasn't the reason she sounded distant, detached. There was something more, something that had shifted between them in the last few days. "I had some things to wrap up at work," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I'm here now. Is everything all right?" She hesitated, then shook her head slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, almost to herself. "About everything. About why we're here." Jameson's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Leila finally turned to face him fully, her arms crossed over her chest as she took a step closer. "I don't think you understand, Jameson. This marriage, this arrangement, it was never just about business for me." He took a step back, his pulse quickening. He had expected a conversation about their arrangement, but not like this. He had known she wasn't entirely indifferent to the situation, he had seen the flicker of emotions in her eyes during their conversations, but he never thought she would confront him so directly. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I'm saying that I didn't marry you because I wanted to be part of your world, Jameson," she said, her voice steady but filled with an unmistakable bitterness. "I married you because I had no choice. And now, I'm realizing that I might have been better off never agreeing to this at all." His heart skipped a beat. "Leila, you knew why we were doing this. We both did. This isn't about love or feelings. It's about securing our futures, about doing what's necessary for the company." That's the problem, she replied, her eyes flashing with something Jameson hadn't seen in her before, frustration, perhaps even anger. It's never been about us, has it? It's always been about business, about control, about what we need from each other. But I'm tired, Jameson. Tired of pretending. Tired of being part of your world when all I am to you is a contract, a piece of paper. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had known, on some level, that this arrangement was a mere formality, a way to fulfill an obligation, but hearing it from her, hearing her lay it out so plainly, made him realize just how much he had taken her for granted. I never meant for you to feel like that, he said, his voice softer now. But we both agreed to this. We both knew what it was from the start. We've been living our separate lives, Leila. That's all this is. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Living our separate lives? Is that what you think this is? Because, for me, it's not. This is everything, Jameson. This is my life, my future. You think I'm just some pawn in your game, but you don't even understand what I've sacrificed to get here. Jameson's chest tightened at her words. He had always viewed this marriage as a transaction, something necessary, something to get through. But the more he listened to her, the more he realized how little he truly understood her, how little he had bothered to understand. You're right, he said, his voice quiet. I've been selfish. I've been focused on the company, on my own needs. I haven't stopped to think about you, about what you might want. There was a long pause as they both stood there, the weight of their words hanging heavy between them. Leila's eyes softened, just for a moment, as if she were considering something, weighing her next move. I didn't expect you to change, she said, her voice quieter now, almost gentle. I never did. But I think you need to understand something, Jameson. I didn't agree to this because I wanted to be your wife. I agreed because I had to. And now, I'm wondering if it was worth it. The word stung, and for a moment, Jameson was speechless. He had never imagined that their arrangement would evolve into something like this, something complicated, something real. But as he looked at Leila, standing there before him, he realized that it had already become more than he could have ever anticipated. She had become more than just a contract, more than just a necessary step in his plan. You don't have to stay if you don't want to, he said finally, his voice raw with an emotion he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. I never forced you into this. But if you're unhappy, if this isn't working, we can figure something else out. Leila's eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, or something deeper. She took a step back, her arms wrapping around herself again as if protecting something fragile. That's the thing, Jameson, she said softly, I don't know what I want anymore. And that scares me. The room fell silent as they both stood there, two strangers bound together by a contract, their lives intersecting in ways neither of them could have foreseen. Jameson felt a surge of guilt, of responsibility. He had always been in control, but now, for the first time, he felt as if he were losing his grip on everything. On the company. On the future. And, perhaps most unexpectedly, on Leila herself. He had come into this marriage thinking it was a simple arrangement, but now, he realized it was anything but. Jameson woke up earlier than usual the next morning. He hadn't slept well the night before, his mind restless and constantly returning to the conversation with Leila. Her words had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had always been a man of control, a man who prided himself on managing every aspect of his life with precision. But with her, it was different. Leila had unraveled something inside him, something he hadn't even realized was there. She had given voice to the things he had buried deep inside, and now, he found it impossible to ignore them. As he dressed for work, he couldn't shake the image of her standing by the window, her arms crossed, her eyes distant. It wasn't just the words she had spoken, it was the look in her eyes, the vulnerability that flashed briefly, the crack in her armor that she so carefully tried to hide. It made him wonder how much of the woman he really knew, and how much was a carefully constructed facade. He tried to focus on the day ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Leila. He had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, focusing solely on his work, that he had forgotten what it was like to be close to someone. To truly know them. To allow someone to see beneath the surface. But with Leila, it was different. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't here just for his wealth or status. She was here for something else, something deeper. And that realization frightened him more than he cared to admit. By the time he arrived at his office, the day was already in full swing. The usual whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and deadlines took over, and Jameson tried to bury his thoughts of Leila beneath the demands of his job. But even as he sat through endless meetings, making decisions that affected thousands of people, a part of his mind kept drifting back to the conversation they'd had the night before. He couldn't help it. He couldn't stop wondering what was going through her mind. What did she really want? And why had she married him if she was so unhappy with the arrangement? When the day finally ended, Jameson felt both mentally and physically drained. He had barely eaten lunch and had pushed through his work without giving it a second thought. But now, as the office cleared out and the sun began to set, he knew he couldn't ignore the tension that had been building between him and Leila any longer. He arrived home later than usual, hoping the quiet of the house might give him a moment of respite. But as he stepped through the door, he was met with an unexpected sight. The house, which had always felt so imposing and sterile, now felt strangely empty. There were no sounds, no soft music playing in the background, no sign of Leila's presence. It was as though she had disappeared. He called her name, but there was no answer. His heart skipped a beat. He immediately felt a sense of panic rising in his chest, but he quickly pushed it down. He told himself she was just in another part of the house, maybe reading or relaxing. Still, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. After a few moments, he decided to search for her. He checked the living room, the kitchen, and the study. No sign of her. It wasn't until he reached the back garden that he found her. She was sitting on a bench near the edge of the property, staring out into the darkening sky. The soft breeze stirred her hair, and for a moment, she looked almost ethereal, lost in thought, far away from everything and everyone. Jameson approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. As he drew closer, he saw that she had a book in her hands, but it was clear she wasn't reading. The book was closed, resting in her lap, her fingers lightly tracing the cover. She seemed so distant, so detached from the world around her, and for the first time, Jameson realized just how much of her remained a mystery to him. "Leila," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost tentative. She looked up at him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was something in her gaze, something he couldn't quite interpret, but it made his heart race. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. There was no anger, no frustration in her tone, but there was a certain sadness that seemed to hang in the air between them. Jameson stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had spent the whole day trying to block out his thoughts about her, trying to convince himself that he didn't care about what was happening between them. But now, as he looked at her, truly looked at her, he knew that wasn't true. He couldn't just ignore the tension, the growing feelings that he didn't understand. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice betraying the concern he had tried so hard to suppress. "You've been quiet tonight." Leila sighed softly, her eyes drifting back to the horizon. "I'm fine, Jameson. Really. I just needed some time to think." "Think about what?" he asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "About us," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About this marriage. About everything." Jameson's heart tightened. He had known this conversation was coming, but hearing her say it out loud felt different, more real, more final. He walked over to the bench and sat down beside her, careful not to invade her space too much. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They just sat there in silence, the sounds of the night filling the air around them. "I didn't expect this," Leila said, her voice breaking the silence. "I didn't expect to feel trapped. To feel like I'm living a life that isn't my own." Jameson's chest constricted at her words. He wanted to say something, anything to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't deny the truth in her statement. He had been so focused on the business aspect of their marriage, on fulfilling his family's expectations, that he had failed to see how deeply it had affected her. How could he have been so blind? "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low. "I never meant for you to feel that way. I thought," he paused, realizing how hollow his words sounded. He had thought that this arrangement would work, that they could both simply play their parts and move on with their lives. But now, he realized how foolish he had been. Leila shook her head, a faint smile playing on her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You didn't know. I don't blame you for that. But I think it's time we faced the truth, Jameson. We're both stuck in this, and neither of us knows how to get out." He looked at her, his heart aching at the sorrow in her voice. He hadn't realized how much she was suffering, how much of herself she had sacrificed in order to fulfill this contract. He had only seen what he wanted to see, his own needs, his own desires, but Leila had her own life, her own dreams, and now, it seemed that she was beginning to see just how much she had given up to be with him. "I don't want you to feel stuck," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "If you want out, if you need to walk away, I won't stop you." Leila turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps for sincerity, perhaps for the truth. "Do you really mean that?" she asked softly. "I do," Jameson replied, his voice steady. "I never wanted to make you feel trapped, Leila. I thought I could control everything, but I was wrong. I don't know what the future holds, but I want you to have the freedom to choose your own path." For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Jameson didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, he realized something that changed everything. He had spent his life controlling everything around him, but Leila wasn't something to control. She was a person, a woman with her own hopes, her own fears, and her own desires. And for the first time in his life, Jameson Wilde wasn't sure he could control anything, not his company, not his future, and certainly not his feelings for the woman sitting beside him. The days following their conversation in the garden were an odd blend of tension and unease. Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted between him and Leila, but he wasn't entirely sure what it meant. They moved through the motions of their daily lives, work, dinner, brief exchanges in passing, but the silence between them was thick and loaded with unspoken words. It was as though a new layer of awareness had been added to their relationship, one neither of them knew how to navigate. Jameson threw himself into his work in an attempt to distract himself from the turmoil inside. His company was on the cusp of a major merger, one that could change the trajectory of Wilde Technologies forever. The stakes were high, and he found himself buried in endless meetings, phone calls, and legal documents. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, he couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that he was neglecting something, someone, that mattered far more than any business deal. Leila, too, seemed lost in her own world. She spent long hours alone in her room or in the study, reading or writing in a journal he had never seen before. She had always been private, but now, there was a distance to her that felt like a wall Jameson couldn't scale. Every attempt to reach out to her felt like hitting an invisible barrier. She would speak to him, but only out of necessity, and her eyes always seemed distant, as though she were looking through him rather than at him. It was on one particularly long night, after another grueling day of back-to-back meetings, that Jameson finally decided to confront the growing chasm between them. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. His marriage, though originally conceived as a mere formality, was now something much more complex, and he wasn't prepared to let it slip away without trying to understand it. He came home later than usual, the house dark and quiet as he stepped through the door. Leila had never been one for late nights out, and she rarely went anywhere without informing him, so the stillness was unsettling. He set down his briefcase and walked toward the study, hoping to find her there. As he approached, he heard the faint sound of music, soft, classical piano notes that seemed to echo through the stillness of the house. He hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, Leila was seated at the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys with a quiet intensity. Her back was to him, and the dim light from the desk lamp cast soft shadows over her face, making her look almost fragile, as if she were lost in a world of her own. The melody she played was haunting, mournful even, and it filled the room with a sense of melancholy that made Jameson's chest tighten. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her, listening to the music, unable to move or speak. He had heard her play before, but this time it felt different, more personal, more raw. The music seemed to echo the way he felt inside, confused, uncertain, yearning for something he couldn't name. "Leila," he finally said, his voice rough from the knot that had formed in his throat. She stopped playing and turned toward him, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that almost made him uneasy. There was no surprise in her expression, no sign that she had been caught off guard. It was as if she had known he would come to find her. "Jameson," she replied softly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before she looked down at her hands resting on the keys. "Can we talk?" he asked, his words hanging in the air between them. She didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, she nodded slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the piano as she stood up. She moved away from the instrument, walking toward the window, her back to him once again as she stared out into the night. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quiet, but steady. "I know things haven't been easy for us. And I'm not sure I'm handling it all the way I should." Jameson stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what she was about to say, but the words he had been dreading seemed to hang in the air, waiting to be spoken. "Leila, I know I've been distant," he said, his voice raw with frustration. "I've been wrapped up in work, in the merger, in everything that's going on with the company. But I can't ignore this anymore. I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." She turned to face him then, her eyes soft, almost vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "I'm not blaming you for anything, Jameson," she said, her voice a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I know we both entered this marriage under different circumstances. You didn't ask for me, and I didn't ask for you. But somewhere along the way, I think we both lost sight of what this is supposed to be. Or maybe we never really understood it in the first place." Jameson felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had always seen their marriage as a necessary means to an end, a contractual obligation, but hearing her speak like this made him realize how little he had considered her perspective. He had never stopped to think about what Leila might want or need from this arrangement. He had only focused on what he needed, what the company needed, and now he could see the cost of that selfishness in her eyes. "I never meant to make you feel like you were just a part of the plan," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted you to feel like this was just business to me, Leila. I know I've failed you. I can't change the past, but I want to do better, if you'll let me." She met his gaze then, her expression thoughtful, almost sad. "I don't know what I want anymore, Jameson. I thought I could do this. I thought I could keep my distance, keep everything separate, and just get through it. But now, I'm not so sure." There was a long silence between them, thick with the weight of her words. Jameson could feel the tension between them, the emotional divide that had been growing since the moment they had married. It was like they were two strangers living under the same roof, bound by a contract but not by any real connection. "Leila," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "I don't know what to say. I can't promise everything will be perfect, but I want to try. I want to understand you better, to make this work. I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this." She looked at him for a long moment, as if considering his words. Finally, she nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping slightly, as though she had let out a breath she had been holding in for far too long. "I don't know what I need either," she said quietly. "But maybe, maybe we can figure it out together. Jameson nodded, his heart swelling with something he hadn't expected, hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A fragile thread that could lead them to something better, something real. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they were at least willing to try. And for the first time since their marriage had begun, Jameson felt like they were on the same page. They stood there for a moment, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but filled with the quiet possibility of something new. Something uncertain, but perhaps, just perhaps, worth fighting for. The days following their conversation felt like a delicate balance. Jameson and Leila moved through the motions of their daily lives with more caution, more awareness of each other's presence. It was clear that something had shifted between them, but what that meant for their future remained uncertain. The tension that had been building in the past few weeks still lingered, but now, it was accompanied by a subtle sense of understanding. They were no longer pretending that everything was fine. They were acknowledging the cracks, the fractures in their relationship, and yet they weren't running from them. For the first time, they were facing the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. Jameson tried to focus on the work that had occupied so much of his attention in the past. The company's merger was edging closer to finalization, and he knew that everything hinged on this. It was a pivotal moment for Wild Technologies, a deal that would redefine the future of his empire. But no matter how much he tried to immerse himself in the numbers and the strategy, his thoughts kept drifting back to Leila. It wasn't that he couldn't compartmentalize, he was very good at that, but there was something about her that made it impossible for him to ignore. She was a constant, a presence that tugged at him, even when he didn't want to be pulled. It was late one evening when Jameson arrived home, exhausted from another full day at the office. The house was quiet, too quiet, and for a moment, he wondered if Leila was out. But as he walked through the hallway, he noticed a faint light coming from the study. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the soft sound of rustling paper and the occasional scratch of a pen. He knocked lightly on the doorframe, and Leila looked up from the desk, her eyes meeting his with a brief flicker of surprise. "I didn't expect you back so soon," she said, her voice calm, but there was a certain tension to it. She had been spending more time in the study lately, as if trying to keep herself busy, to keep her mind occupied. "I got done earlier than I expected," Jameson replied, stepping into the room. "What are you working on?" Leila pushed a strand of hair behind her ear and sighed. "Just some personal things. Writing, mostly." She glanced down at the open notebook in front of her, but her fingers didn't move to pick up the pen. "I've been thinking a lot about the future." Jameson felt a pang of unease at her words. It was as if she was starting to withdraw again, retreating into herself. They had made progress, hadn't they? They had agreed to try, to face their problems together. So why did it feel like she was pulling away? He didn't know if it was fear, or just the weight of everything that had happened between them, but something told him this conversation was going to be difficult. "I thought we were doing okay," he said carefully, his gaze fixed on her. "I know things are still complicated, but I thought, maybe we were starting to figure this out." Leila met his gaze, and for a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched out between them, heavy and thick. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost tentative, but there was an edge of something deeper, something unspoken. "We are, in a way," she said, her eyes searching his face. "But I think we're still lying to ourselves, Jameson. We're pretending that things are fine, that this marriage, this arrangement, can just work itself out. But the truth is, I don't know if I can do this anymore." Her words hit him like a slap, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He had known this was a possibility, that at some point, one of them might reach the breaking point, but hearing it from her, hearing the doubt in her voice, made it feel all the more real. All the more devastating. "You're saying you want out?" His voice was barely above a whisper, the question hanging in the air between them. Leila closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were filled with something raw, something Jameson couldn't fully understand. "I don't know. I don't know if I can keep going like this. I've spent so much of my life being independent, doing things my own way, and now I'm not sure what I am anymore. I don't know who I am in this marriage. I don't know who I am in your life. Jameson felt a sharp pain in his chest, a twist of guilt and regret. This wasn't supposed to be how things went. They had started this whole thing with clear terms, with clear expectations, but now, it seemed like they were both lost in a sea of uncertainty. He had never intended for her to feel like this. She had never been just a part of some business transaction, not to him. But that's what it felt like now, didn't it? He had treated her like a means to an end, and in doing so, he had lost sight of who she really was. I never wanted you to lose yourself in this, Jameson said, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted you to feel like you didn't matter, like you weren't you anymore. But I don't know how to fix this, Leila. I don't know how to undo what's been done. Leila turned away from him, looking out the window, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk. I don't think you can undo it, she said quietly. And maybe that's the problem. We can't go back to how things were before, and we can't pretend that everything's fine now. We've both changed, Jameson. And I don't know if I can live with the way I've changed for you. For this marriage. Jameson stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to tell her that everything would be okay, that they could make this work. But he knew that wasn't what she needed to hear. She didn't need false promises. She needed truth. And the truth was that neither of them knew what the future held. What are we supposed to do? He asked, his voice barely audible. Leila's shoulders slumped as she turned back to face him. Her eyes were filled with unshed tears, but she held them back with a strength that Jameson couldn't help but admire. I don't know, Jameson. I honestly don't know anymore. I don't know if I can stay in a marriage that feels like it's slowly eating away at me. And I don't know if I can keep pretending that this is enough. The words settled in the room like a weight, and Jameson felt every ounce of it pressing down on him. He didn't want to lose her, not like this. Not when they had come so far, when he had finally begun to understand her. He had always believed that everything could be solved through work, through dedication, through his own will. But this was different. This was something he couldn't control. You're not alone in this, he said, his voice a little firmer now. I'm here, Leila. I don't want to lose you, but I can't force you to stay if you're not happy. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with the weight of their shared uncertainty. Jameson felt like they were standing on the edge of something, and he didn't know whether to take a step forward or retreat. He knew that their marriage, what it was, what it had become, wasn't enough to hold them together. But he wasn't sure if anything could be. Finally, Leila spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I need time, Jameson. I need time to figure out who I am, what I want. I don't want to make any decisions right now. I just need some space. Jameson nodded, his heart heavy. Take all the time you need, he said. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. And with that, Leila turned away from him, walking toward the window again, her back to him. Jameson stood there, his chest aching, watching her as she looked out into the night. He didn't know where they would go from here, or if there was even a way back. But for the first time, he realized that their marriage wasn't something he could fix with a few words or a business deal. It was something far more fragile, and far more complicated, than he had ever imagined. And that realization, though painful, was the first step toward the truth they both needed to face. The days following Leila's request for space felt like a blur of uncertainty. Jameson could feel the weight of every moment, every conversation, every glance. The house, once filled with their occasional quiet exchanges, was now unbearably silent. Leila spent more time in her study, locked away in the room with her thoughts, and Jameson buried himself in his work, hoping that if he focused enough on his business, the tension between them might dissipate. But it never did. Their unspoken rift hung over every room, every hallway, like a shadow that refused to leave. He knew she needed time, and he respected that. But the truth was, the longer they both avoided confronting the reality of their situation, the more he realized how deeply he had fallen into the quiet abyss between them. What had once been a business arrangement now felt like a prison for both of them, a cage they couldn't escape. Jameson tried to reassure himself that this distance was only temporary. He told himself that once the deal with the merger was finalized, once the pressure of his family's legacy was no longer weighing on him, things would naturally settle into place. He would have the time to focus on Leila, on the marriage that he had treated like a transaction but now saw as something much more complex. But the more time passed, the more Jameson realized that this approach might be a lie. They had built something fragile together, and now he was learning that fragile things could shatter in a second. It was late one night when everything came to a head. Jameson had spent the evening in meetings that ran late into the night, his mind focused on the final stages of the merger. He had almost convinced himself that this was the one thing that could anchor him, that it was the only thing that mattered. But as he walked through the door of the house, his thoughts were interrupted by the familiar, soft sound of the piano. Leila's music was always the first thing he noticed when he came home, but tonight, it felt different. There was something raw about it, something desperate in the way her fingers struck the keys. It was a melody he hadn't heard before, one that carried a weight of emotion he could almost feel in his own chest. For a moment, he just stood at the threshold of the living room, listening. He could feel the distance between them like an invisible wall, but hearing her play, hearing the vulnerability in the music, made him realize how much he missed her, missed the woman who had once been so full of life and warmth. He walked toward the sound, his footsteps hesitant, unsure of how to approach her. As he reached the doorway, Leila didn't seem to notice him at first. Her back was turned, her head slightly bowed as she played the haunting tune, lost in the music. He watched her for a moment, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows over her face, making her look more distant than ever. It was as if she had retreated into herself, into her own world, where Jameson could no longer reach her. "Leila," he said quietly, his voice breaking the stillness of the room. She stopped playing immediately, the final note lingering in the air before fading into the silence. For a moment, she said nothing, and he wasn't sure if she had even heard him. But then she turned to face him, her expression unreadable, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that was neither anger nor resignation, but a kind of deep sadness that made Jameson's chest tighten. "Why are you still here?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you still holding on?" The question caught him off guard. It wasn't the question he had expected. It wasn't about the merger, or about business, or even about the future they had talked about. It was about them. About the space that had grown between them, the invisible gulf that seemed impossible to cross. "I'm here because I'm not ready to give up on us," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. "I know things have been difficult, and I've made mistakes. But I don't want to walk away. I don't want to let you go, Leila." Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment, Jameson thought she might say something that could either shatter everything or bring them back together. But she said nothing. She simply stood there, looking at him, as though trying to find the right words, but unsure whether she even had them. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted after a long silence. "I don't know what we are anymore, Jameson. I don't know who I am in this marriage. And I'm not sure if I can keep pretending that things will magically get better if we just wait it out." Jameson felt his heart tighten in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to pull her close, but he wasn't sure if she would let him. He wasn't sure if she still wanted him to. The distance between them had become so vast, so wide, that it seemed impossible to bridge. "Maybe we can't fix everything," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "But I'm not ready to let go of you. I know I've failed you in so many ways. I know I've been selfish, and I know I've treated this like it was just a business arrangement. But I don't want to lose you, Leila. Not now. Not after everything we've been through." She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she stepped back, as if creating more space between them. I don't know if I can forgive you, she whispered. I don't know if I can forgive myself for staying, for letting this happen. Jameson's chest tightened, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had done, the realization that he had hurt her in ways he had never even considered. He had been so focused on the business, on the legacy, on fulfilling the obligations set before him that he hadn't seen how much he had neglected the one person who mattered most. Leila had never been just a pawn in his game, and he was just beginning to understand that she had always been more than he had ever allowed himself to see. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice raw with emotion. I can't change what's happened. But I want to try. I want to understand you, Leila. I want to make this work, no matter what it takes. She shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with tears she hadn't let fall. I don't know if we can, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. I don't know if it's enough anymore. The words hit him like a blow. He had never imagined that their relationship could reach this point, that she might decide that it was too late for them. But as he looked at her, as he saw the pain in her eyes, he knew that he couldn't force her to stay. He couldn't make her feel something she didn't feel anymore. He could only offer his sincerity, his willingness to change, and hope that it was enough. I can't promise you that everything will be perfect, Leila, he said, his voice shaking slightly. But I can promise you that I'll try. I'll try to be the man you need me to be. I'll try to give you the space you need, and I'll try to be patient. I won't give up on us. Not unless you tell me that you want me to. Leila looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face, as though weighing the sincerity in his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. I need time, Jameson. I need to figure out who I am without you in my life for a while. I don't know what will happen between us, but I can't make any promises right now. Jameson nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had been asking her for something that she couldn't give, and for the first time, he realized that the only thing he could do was give her the space she needed. He couldn't force her to love him again. He couldn't make her feel something she wasn't ready to feel. But he could be there for her, even if that meant standing back and waiting. I'll give you the time you need, he said quietly. I just hope that when you're ready, we can find our way back to each other. Leila didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she nodded slowly. I don't know what the future holds, Jameson. But I'll think about it. As she turned away, walking toward the window once again, Jameson felt the heavy weight of the uncertainty between them. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. The journey ahead was unclear, but there was still a glimmer of hope, one he wasn't ready to give up on, no matter how difficult it might be. Weeks passed, and the distance between Jameson and Leila became both a heavy burden and a strange kind of relief. They existed side by side in the same house, their worlds orbiting each other but never quite intersecting. Jameson had spent countless hours trying to rebuild the parts of his life that had come undone in the wake of their emotional fallout. He threw himself into work, burying himself in the final stages of the merger that had loomed over his life for months. The deal was nearly done, and with it, he hoped to find some semblance of control again, some way to restore the order he had worked so hard to maintain. But even as his empire continued to grow, as his professional life blossomed into the future he had always envisioned, there was still something missing, someone missing. Leila's absence, the absence of the woman he had promised himself he would never let go of, gnawed at him. Every morning, he would wake up with the quiet hope that things would change, that perhaps the space they had given each other would finally allow them to heal. But every day, as he passed her closed study door or caught glimpses of her distant face in the hallway, he was reminded that time had not healed everything. If anything, it had only created more distance between them. It was late one evening when everything changed. Jameson had come home from the office exhausted, feeling like the weight of the world was finally lifting off his shoulders. The merger was almost done, and the future of Wild Technologies was secured. He had spent months focusing solely on the company, believing that if he could control the business, he could control his life. But tonight, as he stepped into the quiet, empty house, he realized how much he had been fooling himself. He had neglected the most important part of his life, Leila. The house was as still as ever, the soft hum of the city outside the only sound breaking the silence. He walked through the living room, glancing toward the piano in the corner, where Leila had spent so many hours lost in her music. He could feel the familiar pull of it, the way the music had always been the one thing that connected them in their most quiet and intimate moments. But tonight, there was something different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was about to change. He headed toward the study, where he knew she was most likely to be. As he approached, he hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should knock, unsure if she was ready to face him. But something inside him told him it was time to finally confront whatever had been lingering between them, time to speak the truth. He knocked softly, his knuckles barely making a sound against the wood. When there was no immediate response, he slowly pushed the door open. Leila was sitting at the desk, her back to him, a stack of papers in front of her. The soft glow of the lamp cast a warm light on her face, but her expression was distant, her eyes focused on something far away. She didn't seem surprised to see him, in fact, it was as though she had been waiting for him, waiting for the right moment. "Leila," Jameson said, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." She didn't turn around immediately, and for a moment, the silence stretched out between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Then, finally, she slowly turned in her chair, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in her gaze, no frustration. Just a quiet, almost resigned calmness. "I know," she said softly. "I've been waiting for you to come to me." Jameson's heart raced at her words. He wasn't sure what to expect, but this, the calmness in her voice, the resignation, told him that something had changed, something that neither of them could undo. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, trying to find the right words. "I've been avoiding this," he admitted. "Avoiding you. I thought that if I just kept working, if I kept pushing everything else forward, that things would fix themselves. But I've realized now that I was wrong. I've spent so much time focusing on the wrong things, and I've let you slip further away from me. I don't want that anymore, Leila. I don't want to keep pretending that we're fine when we're not." Leila looked at him for a long time, her eyes studying him, searching for something she wasn't sure she would find. "I've been thinking a lot, too," she said quietly. "About what we are, about what we've become. And I'm not sure I know anymore, Jameson. I'm not sure I know who we are, or who I am in this. It's like we've been living in parallel lives for so long, and now I'm not sure if they can ever truly intersect again." Jameson felt a sharp pang of sorrow. He had always feared that this would happen, that they would lose themselves to the weight of their roles, the expectations, and the contracts. He had underestimated how much Leila had given up to be in this marriage, how much of her own identity she had sacrificed. He had been so focused on his own goals that he hadn't seen the strain it had placed on her. "I don't know what to say," he said softly. "But I don't want to lose you, Leila. Not like this. I'm not asking for things to go back to how they were. I don't think that's possible. But I want to try again. I want to figure out what we can be together, without all the expectations and all the pressure. I want to give you the space you need, but I also want to be with you. Not as a business arrangement, not as a duty, but because I want you in my life." Her gaze softened slightly, and for the first time in a long while, Jameson saw a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or the faintest trace of the woman he had once known. She stood up slowly, walking over to the window, her back to him. "I've been scared," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I've been scared of losing myself. I've been scared that if I let you in again, I'll lose what's left of who I am." Jameson stood, unsure of what to say, but he stepped closer to her, his voice gentle but firm. "Leila, I'm not asking you to lose yourself. I'm asking you to trust me again, to trust that I can be the man you need, not the man I've been. I know I've hurt you, and I can't undo that. But I want to show you that I can be better, for both of us." She turned then, her face pale, but there was something new in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. A spark, a glimmer of the woman she had once been, and the woman she might still be. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said softly, her voice wavering. "But I want to try. I don't want to give up on us, either." Jameson's heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in months, relief, yes, but also the stirring of something deeper, something he had almost forgotten existed between them, the hope that they could still build something from the ashes of their brokenness. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, and there would be moments of doubt, moments where they would both question whether they were doing the right thing. But for the first time in a long while, Jameson felt like they were on the same path, walking towards something they couldn't see yet, but something worth finding. "I'll be here," he said quietly, taking a step closer. "I'll be here, whenever you're ready." Leila looked at him then, her expression softening, and for the first time, she reached out and touched his arm. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. The space between them wasn't gone, but it was shrinking. The walls that had separated them, built over weeks of silence and fear, were starting to crack. And as they stood there, together, for the first time in what felt like forever, Jameson felt the quiet promise of something new between them. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't healed yet, but it was a beginning. A beginning they both desperately needed.